of in this kind of work, which is a privilege to me. I'm also happy to meet again Dr. Zilberstein, because it was the first time in Sao Paulo, thanks to you. So this is a great opportunity to be here again. I just give you some suggestions from about case studies and line of interpretation I am trying to elaborating on this empirical evidence, looking using the Meso-Institutional Theory. I have to anticipate that it will be the presentation will be not more than a sort of list of problems, and I hope at least that the problem may be clearly presented. I don't know if I have some problem with the. Okay, can you see? Using the Meso-Institutional Theory, I refer to the theory as very well presented by Claude Menard in different papers, and also reminded this morning in his presentation in the first panel. In this presentation, I would like to spend some words about the question, and then I try to draw from theory to illustrate, to focus on the institutional nature of interbranch organization, a very complex organization which are differently used in Europe for several reasons, historical reasons, and also regulation reasons. Then I will introduce at the end some final remarks, hoping that they may help me to go ahead. The research question concerned about the institutional nature of interbranch organization. Interbranch organizations are normally classified as arrangement, as a hybrid arrangement, or in any case, organizations which are built on by the agent in order to organize their transaction. This is the basic interpretation we have in literature. But I think that this kind of interpretation could be innovated by using the lens of Meso-Institutional Theory, even though the focus remains on basic transaction among the producer organization, all the collective agents, farmers, and processor, which is the main field in which this kind of interbranches are active and built on. And I have to say also that in the law, European law, these organizations are thought of being as a sort of complex and necessary instrument to make more strong the contractual power of the farmer. This is at least the general framework in which they are presented. I will use some elements from background case studies concerning the fruit and vegetables sector in Italy. Basically, in this sector, we deal with organizational transactions which are basically hybrid in nature. We have supply contract between a producer organization and processing company, or by other kind of buyers, also on the side of the large distributor retailers. In some cases, we have also outside of the fruit and vegetable sector a sort of contractual framework, which is the framework which allow the supply contract to be designed and signed in a more efficient way. They are not so much diffused because we have that different interbranches, different relationships, system of relationships are at stake in this sector, and where the organization are better designed and implemented, the contractual framework are really at stake, and they provide some results, some effective results. But this is not the case in all the sector I'm trying to refer to. This sector, especially fruits and vegetables, are strongly affected by market uncertainty and technological uncertainty. This is because of the nature, the seasonal nature of the production, the variation of fluctuation of the demand on the market side, and on the technological side, because of reasons related to quality and safety issues. So this complex organizational arrangement are required also in order to cope with this kind of uncertainty. In European legislation, we have several attempts which are aimed at regulating more strongly the interaction along the chain, introducing inter-branch organization. This is the case also for fruits and vegetable cases. And you know, in Europe, we have a sort of hierarchy in regulation. We have the European law, normally the regulation itself, and the member state law, which are, depending on the constitutional law of the state, which are requested to translate this kind of European legislation. This is the case also for the inter-branch organization part, which are relevant in the specific law, European law, which have been introduced in Italy since a very small span of time, because we have the first complete regulation, let's say, which starts around 2013, and some of these, even though in some sector already there were already existed already some inter-branch organization, they really come to the light and start to functioning just since this time deadline. One point is that in regulation, the inter-branch are seen as entities which are able to intervene in different areas. I tried to list this area, let's say on the left side of the table, information, market, contract, and so on. This can be done just looking at the function as they are described in the legislation, in the law. So looking at this area, one point is to see how this area poses different needs of coordination. This is the first point. The second point is a question whether or not intervening in different areas like that, like those, there is possibility that some tension arise in organizing really the intervention. And third point is concerned with the difficulty which may arise in having really in a unified integrative framework all these areas managed by just one organization, an inter-branch organization which should work for allowing the transaction of the goods and services at stake, but also working from providing information, working for innovation, providing food safety protocols, and so on. This is one of the difficulties on the table, in my view. As for the main scope, the main aim of the inter-branch organization, that is to say the development of efficient exchange, the possibility of allowing the parties to undertake an efficient, well-organized transaction. What happens is that the inter-branch organization basically set up a sort of contracting arena, which is, let's say, the playground where the agents play the game of transacting and organizing the transaction. Basically, this is the scheme which might be drawn from the case, for example, of the tomato sector inter-branches. There is a sort of contracting arena, and then we have contractual framework, like in the hybrid organization, and the supply contract. So the two boxes, the internal boxes, represent the hybrid area, let's say, which is now designed and implemented within a contracting arena, which is aimed to allow the parties to economize on transaction costs. This is the effect of inter-branch organization, which is one of the intended effects pursued by the European Union. And I have to say that in some cases this really happened. If we go further in using the Meso-Institutional Theory, I take for granted that everyone of you knows this theory. One point is to identify the function of this entity, inter-branch, carry out with respect of the three institutional layers. And it is almost easy to find out in the law how the function carried out by the interbranch organization can be classified in terms of meso-institutional function. I tried to do that in this table and next one, referring to the articles of the law. One point in this case is that in the case studies I have using is that we have very well defined and easy identifiable the translation and translating and monitoring function, but there is a small room for enforcement, which is the third very relevant meso-institutional function. I can say that there is some reason for that, which is not really a proper explanation beyond the description I can provide to you of what I found in the field of the empirical research. I think that there are mainly two reasons. One is that these organizations are quite young, and so they are building on also the internal organization, the architecture of the function. And the other one is that there is a sort of dependencies. So where in some territories, for example, we have very better organized interbranch organization, more effective with stronger enforcement, and less in other areas. This depends also on the culture and all the experience in collaboration which the territories have. I say territories because this enforcement comes from specific geographical area. Another point of I'd like to point out about the using Meso-Institutional Theory in looking at these entities concerned with the operational mechanism they use. One of these mechanisms I have already mentioned is one of these mechanisms, which is the contracting arena. Then we have also different guidelines and protocols and procedures just intended to treat with the different area of intervention I mentioned in the past slides. So we have different functions, not fully developed, and different mechanisms. And this may help us in saying that, yes, this intervention organization may be classified as a meso-institutional entity rather than like in the past hybrid organization, which are more concerned with the second layer of the three-layer institutional architecture identified by Claude Menard. And in doing that, I also have to say that one point relevant in empirical analysis seems to me is also the point of the borders between the layers, especially in the case of meso and micro, because in this way, identifying the border, looking at, like in this case, at the contracting arena and contractual framework, we have the possibility to delimit the object of analysis. That is to say, the entity to which connects the function we are discussing, and I try to present to you. So, if this kind of interpretation might be could be admitted, a series of issues could be better defined. For example, how the coordination in different areas could be really organized, what are the tensions, what are the mechanisms, internal mechanisms which need to be addressed. I'd like to emphasize this point because if we look at the area of intervention of interbranch organization and other organization in food chain, we have we can see that different objectives are at stake. Some objectives relate to the strictly to the transaction exchange of goods, but other objectives concerned with the interest or inducement coming from the society. So there is also an issue of the nature of this kind of different kind of objective, and this is intriguing because we have similar problems also in hierarchies, also in the firm. Some firms are trying to evolve. Being able to treat with a different kind of objective. The same could be in the case of this complex organization. This is one of the issues which should be treated, and also drawing from of forecasting empirical evidence. So I'd like to stop here and thank you for the attention paid to this list of issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Gaetano. I know it's very, very challenging to speak in 10 minutes is such a complex and interesting issue. So we'll now go on with the Bachelor of Science. He is a professor at PEA-USP, very well known for everybody in the group. So Bachelor, the floor with you. 10 minutes since it's the culture of the organization. Yes, with you.
But I will do my best without the PowerPoint because I can see the PowerPoint, but I cannot project to you. Anyway, okay. It's a pleasure also to be here together with Jos, with Paula, and with Gaetano, all friends, all people that I know very well, including yourself, Marcio, people that I have a respect and I follow your career and your research activities. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about
do you want to send to me? I can pass for you.
I cannot send to you. I cannot send to you because I don't have an internet connection. So I do like in the old times. So I'll move on. So the topic I'm going to share with you is performing empirical research in contracts. And this is an issue that I have been worried for a long time. I already had a paper on that very particular topic that I'm going to share with you. Basically, what I'm going to talk to you is about the motivation to collect contracts and in order to do empirical work. And I'd like to talk about a little bit about the difficulties to use legal contracts in order to perform studies on institutional arrangements. And then I'm going to bring some measurement cost arguments to support my points based on Joran Barzel. And finally, maybe we're going to have time for discussions. Let me start by mentioning Ronald Coase's Nobel lecture. He mentions the following point: information available in business contracts remains unexplored by economists. Therefore, there is an incentive for collecting and organizing contract data applicable to perform empirical research in analysis of governance. So Coase mentioned that, and he motivated some people to start collecting, gathering data on contracts. And my point is the following: contract databases capture only part of the incentives that shape the observed institutional arrangements. So we must handle this kind of data with some care. I like to add 2 points. One is to recognize the need to collect data in order to perform an empirical analysis. When you move into the empirical analysis of contracts in economics of organizations, we usually, if we move on to collect our own data, usually we're going to face the problem to work with small numbers. But on the other hand, there are interesting sets of contracts available that we can rely upon to do some research. But then we have to recognize the nature of the information that these written contracts bring to us. So we must recognize the limitation they have to perform empirical work. Why I'm saying that? The contract data collects the information, presents the information when the contract was drafted, capture the legal rights using Barzel's jargon. And this reflects how transaction parties shape the contract incentives at that particular time. On the other hand, when you look at the to the transaction that we want to study, there are many dynamic elements that are embedded and they're absent from the contract data collection. Mainly, it misses the relational elements that are built through time. So this is my main point. Usually the contract data, the information that we have, they lack some very valuable information. In the contract, we have only the legal enforcement part of the agreement. Contracts in some way are simple. The transaction, it has, in terms of exchange of property rights, it exceeds the legally protected rights dimensions. Economic rights also are relevant to shape the observed institutional arrangements, the strategy that the organization is drafting. However, it is not present in the written contract. So we have two types of biases. One is the static bias. The question here is, does the data that we have captures all the existing incentives at the time the contract was drafted? Usually, the answer is no. It captures part of it. It's a simplification of the real world. But I like also to mention the dynamic bias, which is, does the data capture the relational incentives that shape the observer transaction and that evolves through time? So we are dealing with two types of biases that we must be aware of in order to do empirical works. Contracts are defined as agreements enforceable by the legal system. It is one among the many other institutional mechanisms to enhance the human cooperation in joint production efforts. The transactions differ from the agreements, and so this is the key element behind my argument. In terms of contracts and norms, if we contrast contracts on one hand and informal norms on the other hand, the question that I place is, how relevant are the non-contractual dimensions, the dynamic transaction elements that exist behind the scenes? And there's many authors dealing with this topic. I would like to mention at least 4 of them. One is the relational contracts brought by McNeil that we listened this morning about. The other issue are the informal norms that Dixit and Hart present in their theories. The third author that can be considered is Klein, based on his very interesting concept of self-enforcing mechanisms. And finally, measurement cost theory, which is the Brazilian concept that I'm going to explore. In terms of this issue, there are 3 arguments that I like to mention. One, informal institutions, they might evolve very rapidly, and they evolve rapidly enough not to be ignored. Second, institutional arrangements are not fully determined only by formal norms. And third, intra-firm and inter-firm exchange contracts evolve through time. They are not static. The contract just put in motion a relational perspective. This is what McNeil brought to the literature. So we must handle with care. Let me just explore a little bit of the Brazilian concept. To support the importance of mechanisms other than contracts that shape the observed institutional arrangements, Yoram Barzel considers that any transactions, in fact, have many attributes. And what we transact are not but the different attributes to which we have different degrees of property rights in terms of capturing the value of those attributes. Contracts will delineate some, but not all relevant attributes in the transaction. There are many unpriced and difficult to measure margins that will not be present in the contracts. Therefore, based on Barzel, we can say that easy to measure attributes will be the basis of the exchange of legal rights based in contracts. They are seen as enforceable by courts. On the other hand, difficult to measure attributes will be behind the exchange of economic rights, in which reputational mechanisms are present and are not enforceable by courts, but privately enforced. I'm not going to show you this a picture that I drafted to consider that in any transaction, when we have the different attributes being transacted, for each attribute, we're going to have a mixture of contracts and agreements, of economic rights and legal rights at the same time. They are, as I said, not static. The mix between contracts and agreements will change through time, and they will be the basis of the real world transaction. Therefore, the contract will capture just part of it. There are some dynamics between contracts and agreements. There is evolution of relation and transaction, as I mentioned. There is a process of learning how to measure also. So even courts will be able, through time, sometimes to learn how to measure. Therefore, you can transform agreements into contracts. And also you have to develop, we also have the dynamics between contracts and agreements. So we're going to have the effect of the reputational mechanisms, the development of trust. Learning how to contract is a topic that Klein explored many years ago. And there is a learning process of the courts. So we also can look to the courts under the point of view that they also developed some competences to measure. So still we're going to have some unprotected value, but this is not a topic that I'm going to address right now. Going to the conclusions. In order to, it's very relevant to perform empirical work, we know. In order to do that, we have to check the actual bundle of property rights that is being exchanged, to check the relational aspects behind the transaction, and check the existence of informal norms. I like to finalize with the following point. Dynamic elements evolve through time, and therefore the originally drafted contracts are likely to disconnect from the actual governance mechanisms. If we aim to study what goes on in the real world, then we must carefully examine the likely changes that the transactions went through time when using the existing contract data. So I hope that this point does not, how can I say, not to bring some motivation to perform empirical work. We need to do that, but we need to do that with care. So those are my points. Thank you, Marcio.
Thanks a lot, Décio, for your presentation. Almost on time. Now we go on with Annie. She's from the University, Laval University. She is currently in Canada in the sabbatical year. Thanks for joining us in your sabbatical year.
Thank you for this introduction. So I'm really pleased to be with you this morning. Just before sharing my screen, I just want to check if it's possible to share it yet. I just want to share with you one moment I had with Cassia, because this is kind of a tribute for her, right? I met Cassia in Paris. She spent 1 year in Paris as a visiting student. We were both at the Centre Atome, directed by Claude Ménard. And so I had this chance to be with her for 1 year. And Claude would, during all my PhD, I was doing my PhD there. And during all those years, he used to invite scholars from all around the world to come and give talks and courses, and we would, of course, benefit from this. We would go to these seminars, and I remember one seminar. There was this economist who was talking about transaction costs and contracts and property rights, and then Cassia asked a question about the fairness. What about fairness in contracts? How is it taken into account? And the answer was something, there's no such thing as fairness as in contracts. There's a fairness, but from an economic point of view. And so, you know all Cassia, she was a really kind person, very social, joyful, empathetic, but then she would become really upset about this answer. And I decided to devote my presentation to this question of fairness in contracts today. I'm not an expert in fairness, and this is a very delicate subject actually, but now I'm gonna share my screen, and I think Cassia would have liked this presentation anyway. So it's not a presentation of a typical traditional paper. It's just that I'm bringing some ideas up about this. So if I want to see my slides well. So I titled my presentation, Contract Farming, Getting Over the Fairness Issue to Overcome Current and Future Challenges. So contracts have been, for the last 30 years at least, contract agriculture has been expanding, and for many reasons, because they're quite efficient in reducing uncertainty, provide better market access to producers, both in developing and developed countries. They're a mean of risk sharing. They can provide better access to inputs and financing in it everywhere. They're in the literature, it says that they're a mean to improve the welfare of smallholders. They are widely used in developed and developing countries. In industrialized agriculture like Canada, United States, Europe, they are used to better coordinate chains, better coordinate quality, and so on. And the literature on informal contracts says that they can lower costs, so that there would be some benefits in using informal contracts as well. But what we see also is that producers are also subject to contractual hazards by using contracts. They usually have a weaker negotiation power, which leads to inequitable allocation of risks and responsibilities within contracts. Some contracts lack clarity, and producers do not have a lot of legal literacy, and it's normal. I do not have either. So there's a lack of understanding of what it says in the contracts, a lack of pricing transparency, because sometimes the prices come up from formulas that are quite complicated, and it's really hard for a producer to understand that. Some contracts have overly restrictive confidentiality clauses. I remember in the United States, for instance, some contracts, it's written that the content of the contract cannot be shared to anybody, even the spouse of the producer. And some contracts do not have dispute resolution process. So there are like many hazards that can come up from these things, these clauses. So there are basically, I would call ex ante and ex post issues to using contracts, because and they come from unbalanced negotiation power, information asymmetry between partners. The cost of enforcing contracts for small businesses is really high, so producers don't enforce their contracts. And in some countries, actually, third-party enforcement is really rare or non-existent. And so there have been a lot of debates beginning in the 60s in France, Spain in the 80s, US in the 90s, more recently in the UK about dairy contracts, and in Canada also about hog integration contracts. And some people think, well, producers, they're just going from price takers to contract takers. So I was wondering, contracts, are they mechanisms of exploitation or efficient instrument of coordination? And no, I'm not answering to these questions in that presentation, but it gave me this idea. These questions come up from one of my reading of a paper And I came up with some ideas. I came up with reading that paper with some ideas. Are there, like, for instance, are there some contexts more favorable to fair contracting than others? Does the market structure have a role to play? Going back, so I decided to go back to the industrial organization basics and to present you results from a research project I've done with a colleague a while ago in 2014. We collected data and we've done quite an extensive study comparing two sectors, the processed vegetable sector and the hog sector, with completely different contractual relations in both. And we wanted to know why these differences. So this takes place in Canada, in the province of Quebec, of course. We interviewed 30 hog producers, 11 vegetable growers, and about 15 processing integrating firms from both sectors. And in the processed vegetable sector, there are 555 producers. There were actually in 2013. And there is one big buyer, Bonduelle. And in the hog chain, there were 800 producers that had integration contracts and about 7-8 integrators. But there was a reputation effect that makes switching integrator really difficult, because everybody knows everybody. And if you're a producer switching integrator because you're not happy with your contract, then you can end up with no contract. Integrators talk to each other. That's what was said in the study. So when we compared hog integration contracts versus processing vegetable contracts, we looked at the effect of asset specificity, uncertainty, and exit options on the bilateral dependence. The exit options is a kind of a proxy, or at least a measurement of the contract partner possibilities. Do the producer or the buyer have other possibilities of contracting with other partners? And we looked at, we asked different questions to hog producers, but also hog integrators. We tried to evaluate the level of asset specificity, uncertainty, and the exit options. And the interesting result from this was really about the exit options, because of course there's a high asset specificity almost everywhere and uncertainty, but the exit options were different. The hog production, the producers, they don't have that many options actually. They are very limited in partners. But the hog integrators at that moment in 2013, they had plenty of farmers to contract with, because the price of corn was really high and producers were really in a bad situation. They were seeking for integrators. And in the processed vegetable, the asset specificity was really low for producers. Why? Because those producers, they have a land and they can grow anything. They can grow processed vegetables, but also corn and soybeans and whatever. And so they have a lot of exit options. And the vegetable processor, they have the only firm had to get the vegetable from a very close location because of quality issues. The firm couldn't go in the United States or another province, or even other regions in the province. They had to take their vegetables from very near. So they had not that many exit options. So the result of this situation was that hog producers had a very strong dependency towards integrators. And when we looked at the contract, we saw a lot of lack of transparency in contracts, and the relation was dictated by the integrator. And in the vegetable, in the processed vegetable sector, it was the opposite actually. The contract were really transparent, and the actors would say that those contracts were fair in terms of price, risk sharing, and all the various clauses. But those are just ideas that lead me to a next post-explanatory hypothesis, is that the competitive environment impacts the exit options, and then which impacts the negotiation power, which impacts the content, transparency, and fairness of contracts. And still, fairness is still a very awkward word in economics anyway. Having said that, in Europe, mostly in Europe, but also here in Canada, I can see this. There is this resurgence of debates about over the fairness of agri-food chains. But the concept of fairness goes beyond contract fairness. It includes societal concerns. Maybe it has been brought up by the pandemic, I don't know, but there are social concerns about the classical market, I would say contracts, the mechanism that is coordinating, that do not provide adequate incentives to ensure sustainable production. And sustainable is economic, social, and environment, right? There is more importance given to the multifunctionality of agriculture. What if small farms cannot make it because of low returns? What if no investments on farms in the long run? How will our territory be occupied? Those are questions that are raised in Europe, but also in Canada. But what type of agriculture? And there's this idea of keeping a local agriculture to ensure market stability and less price volatility, at least in the European case. And consumer fairness is also brought up. And besides this, there is this development of digital economy, and contractual issues are at the heart of this development of this digital economy in agriculture. But I wrote same old because we end up with the same contractual hazard and problems, actually. So data governance is basically laid down in contracts. The contracts are the masterpiece in data governance between the producers and the industrial technology players. There is some specificity of digital data in agriculture. There is asymmetry in knowledge and expertise between producers and those tech firms. Trust is difficult to obtain in those relations because of this asymmetry. And in agriculture, we have this unbalanced power among parties. It does not help the trust issue. So many say that the literature say, and many scholars, expert in this, say that the use of contracts may not be enough to create a climate of confidence in data generator, that is producers, which can discourage producers from participating in data economy. So what are the solutions? There are voluntary codes, contract models, guides. It's been used in agricultural contracts for a while. And now there are some of those that are put in place for data also, agricultural data, digital data. Those codes, they can reduce information asymmetry, they can promote better practices and equity, but they mainly remain voluntary. And so are they used? Are they efficient? What are their impact of having such codes and guides? And I was really curious. I looked at the literature and there's not much about this, about the answering those questions actually. And those codes are really, they're everywhere. There is also this solution of regulations. Regulation of agricultural contracts, mainly because regulation of agricultural data we're not there yet. Those regulations, they suffer from weak deterrent power, really low fines, at least in the United States or in Canada, for instance. And there is this problem, this issue of competition among regions and countries that reduce their efficiency. And this is true for agricultural contracts, but also for data, digital data. And data is even worse because data, they have no barriers at all. So we need a unified, homogeneous regulation, international, to get over that issue. What else? Institutional organizational mechanisms that can bypass problems or enhance producers' negotiation power. So collective action. But I believe there's not enough research done on the interaction of collective action and contracts, and also the enforcement. It's really good to have collective action that can support contracting, but what about the enforcement at the end? Do the enforcement is available at low cost for producers? And so I conclude. Yes. So I believe research on how to ensure more contractual fairness is far from being completed. Even the word fairness is awkward for us in economics. And at the same time, there are new challenges that make the issue even more important. New societal concerns, new sustainability concerns, whole chain concerns, the development of the digital economy, as I just explained. But still, we have those new challenges, but the same old issues we didn't get over yet. The negotiation power competitive issue, still very important to consider, I believe. And so I would conclude in saying that maybe the data economy will impose a solution. I'm working on this in this theme for the last 2-3 years now. And scholars working on digital data, they seem much less embarrassed to talk about fairness, because fairness is at the basic of trust, and trust is really needed to go on with this new revolution. And as social scientists in the agri-food sector, we are multidisciplinary by nature, and I believe we are well positioned to put in our 2 cents in the future solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie, for your very interesting presentation. And we now go on with George Digman. I apologize for not being able to say your name correctly. So you have 10 minutes, a little bit more, because if I have to use it 2 or 3 minutes more. With you, the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcio. And I think you pronounced my name very good, so no problem at all. Trying to find my PowerPoint. Where is it? Ah, here it is. So okay, can you see it? Okay.
I can see it. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, particularly to Sylvia. I very much appreciate being in this workshop or this conference, and it's an honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to see all my friends from all around the world and from people that I collaborated a couple of years ago. And it's also nice to that this is in honor of Kasia. I collaborated with Kasia. This is more than 10 years ago in a project on biodiesel value chains, institutions, producer organizations, together also with Deso Silberstein. And Kasia spent time in Wageningen, and we had a very good time. And what I particularly liked, and this has been said actually today already a few times, he was a very warm person, a very interested person, a very also a very humble person, and it was just very nice to collaborate with her. So he was very interested in everything that's going on, and I think the presentation and the introduction that Annie was given was I think the best one could say about Kasia. So there's not so much more I should say. I just want to show one slide that she always emphasized, and this is a slide, of course, that people that have been working in Penza know very well. But she always emphasized that where we at Wageningen, at least of my group, we were working on the value chains. She always emphasized, yeah, but also include the bigger picture. There is an institutional context, there is an institutional environment, there is organizational environment. And so she always, and that was logical because of her background in law and in policy studies. So I very much enjoyed and valued her emphasis on the broader societal or institutional context. And we had a joint publication in the energy policy. So again, I had very good memories of working with Kasia. So now let's move on to the presentation. What I would like to do, give a short presentation of a study that actually one of my PhD students carried out on contract farming arrangement in Africa. And maybe I have to warn you, because this or warn is not the right word, but this presentation is very much complementary to what Annie Royer was just presenting. She presented the broader picture. I'm kind of narrowing back to the very micro, very managerial perspective of what contract farming arrangements are or could be. So yeah, I think those the presentation of Annie just before this and mine could be very complementary. So what we start with is looking at typologies of contract farming arrangements or contract farming models. The most classical one is the one by Michael and Jones in 1963, pretty old, but still used very often, also used by Supal Singh in his study in 2002, making the distinction between market specification contracts, production management contracts, resource providing contracts, where you see from market to the resource providing, it's an increasing level of value chain or supply chain coordination. You could also say an increasing level of control or command of the agribusiness firm over the farmer. It depends a little bit on how you want to see this, but this is a classical one. But and then there is from the FAO, the Eaton and Shepard publication 2001, which is not exactly a typology of contract farming arrangement, but more of contract farming models, where they emphasize which parties are involved, and it's more, let's say, from a policy point of view. But we were not very happy with this arrangement and models. Because they are actually very much they're evidence-based, yes, they are, but they're mainly descriptive models or arrangements, and there is not that much theory behind it. And what we wanted to do in this paper is come up with a new typology that is more strongly based on theory, and then particularly on the transaction cost economics theory, as developed by, of course, Williamson, has been mentioned, but many others as well. So why do we need a new typology? Or why do we need a typology in the first place? We need a typology for practice, for businesses to implement effective contract farming arrangement with farmers, or small farmers, but also with large farmers. The previous presentation gave a number of examples of those type of contracts. For academia, we need to understand what are the drivers, the constraints, the impact, the durability maybe of the contract arrangement. And policymakers, since they, particularly in the developing world, they emphasize a lot that contract farming arrangement is a way to help farmers connect better to markets. So we need to know, these policymakers need to know whether that actually works and how that works, and which arrangements may be better in particular contexts or particular situations. And as I said, the older typologies were more empirical descriptions, so we want to base our new typology more on transaction cost economics. So, and also, we use an agribusiness perspective. So this is very much a management perspective. So where we look at, well, older contract farming typologies may have looked at the perspective or were developed maybe from the perspective of the farmer. We explicitly took the agribusiness perspective. And one of the reasons also is that there are so many, certainly in the developing world, there are so many contracts that do not last, or farmers easily leave them, or they do side selling, or they don't stick to the contract, or the agribusiness firm doesn't honor the contract. So there's a lot of examples, or a lot of incidents of contracts not working. Maybe at the beginning, but not being sustainable in a way of durability. So taking that agribusiness perspective and using a transaction cost economics theory perspective, we emphasize the asset specificity that is relevant, important for the agribusiness, the physical, temporal, or brand specificity, and the uncertainty, which can be about environmental uncertainty, about weather or pests, or at least something that is beyond control of the actors in the contracting arrangement. But there's also the element of behavioral uncertainty, which is more about not knowing whether the other party will honor the contract. So, and then, so what we wanted to emphasize is that each of these contracts provide a solution to the risk and of high asset specificity, or a certain level of asset specificity, and a certain level of uncertainty. So this is the basic scheme that we have been using. It's very simple, but we wanted to keep it quite simple in order to make it operational and to be able to also to test in some of the in one of the countries that the PhD student was actually working. So what we did was testing our new typology with data from 8 case studies from Zimbabwe, 4 wheat case studies, and some of the wheat went into processing. Some of the wheat we only looked at the first buyer, and then the buyer was a trading company, and for the other cases the buyer was a processing company. Similarly, for the tomatoes, we looked at tomatoes where the farmers sold to traders for fresh markets, and we looked at tomatoes for the processing industry. So those were the different case studies that we have been, and then we ended up with this basic typology. So we have a 2x2 framework where we emphasize the 4 different contracts: group contract, total contract, market contract, and a lien contract. And the group contract, and I think that is really something new compared to earlier typologies, that we emphasize the role of collective action. It was mentioned by previous presentations also: farmer organization, producer organization, maybe interbranch organizations or cooperatives. They have a major role to play in the contract. So they mediate between the farmers as a large group and the agribusiness firm. And these group contracts are often used for, those are standard products, for private label product. Milk is probably the most well-known example. So there is certainly a high asset specificity from the processor side, but also from the farmer side. There is technical assistance often provided by the firm and together with the farmer organization. So there is an issue of trust that is important. Farmers are members of these organizations because they have because they expect benefits, but they also have a certain level of trust in the management or the leadership of this organization. So those are important elements of the group contract. If we go to the right side, then the total contract, which is a contract that's being used in the case of high asset specificity and high uncertainty, then we see that the agribusiness firm is kind of completely commanding and controlling the value chain. So this is what we see in cases where vegetables have to comply to very high levels of quality standards. And then the technical assistance provided by the firm. So on the lower left side, where we have low asset specificity, low uncertainty, that's where the market contracts comes in. This is the, well, you could call that the classical market contract, low vertical coordination, mostly for commodities that you can sell everywhere, that are not easily perishable or not easily lose their quality. And then finally, another intermediate contract is the lean contract for commodities that are useful for processing but are not that vulnerable, and where there is still some competition in the market. So this is basically the core of our new typology, where we emphasize that the group is a new element and the lean contract as an intermediary is also a new element. So wrapping up my presentation, I think there are two questions that we would like to work on over the coming years. Is to what extent do the actors matter? Should we distinguish between different types of agribusiness firms and different types of farmers and farms? I think it does matter who is actually engaging in this contract. Are these large firms, international firms, firms that care about their reputation? The same, is the farm large or small? Is the farmer knowledgeable? Has he a high level of education? So these things may differ. And finally, I think another interesting future research line is the embeddedness of the contracts in the institutional context. This was mentioned earlier today also by Claude Menard in his presentation, that the embeddedness of contracts in the institutional context, which in our research we didn't pay attention to, but it definitely is an important part of future research. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention and give the word back to the chairman.
Thanks, Joe, very much for your presentation. Before immediately to Paula, Annie has raised the fairness issue, Paula, and I don't want to be unfair with you, but please mind the time as much as you can. We're running out of time. So Paula from the University, Paula Schneider from the University of São Paulo.
Oh, hi, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be here and to be part of the tribute to Cássia. And as many of you have already said, I think that one important aspect was her very friendly and human side. And I'd like to share one recollection, which was when I first joined the research group, Pensa, as an undergraduate student, and Cássia was there, and she was the one introducing me to everybody, and she would always be there to make sure I had everything I needed and I felt comfortable there. And she was always concerned in creating a very friendly environment for us. And I'm sure she would be very happy if she could be here with us to see the very positive and very friendly environment in our seminar today. So, I'm very happy to be here. And I was also felt very challenged when I saw the topic of the presentation, New Research Frontiers and Applications. I think there's a lot to talk about the new applications. But if I could define it in one word, I would say the word would be diversity. And we could see that in the very diverse presentations we had this morning, all of them very instigating and interesting, but mostly very diverse ways of taking the Coasian and the Williamsonian perspectives and applying them in different ways. So my presentation will also be about diversity, but the diversity of organizational arrangements, namely different ways of organizing production, different ways of contracting for. And we can see that diversity not only in the different objects that we've seen throughout the morning, but we can see a diversity of ways of organizing different sectors. So we have firms in different sectors operating differently. We have differences among firms. And we also have a diversity in terms of the transactional level. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we look at different transactions, we will find different organizational arrangements or different contracts to deal with the different drivers for those transactions. And that's very well explained by most of the theories of the firm, and especially transaction cost economics. If we have different drivers, if we have a different level of asset specificity or uncertainty, we will have different solutions. So basically, we have different solutions given different conditions. But I want to call your attention about the possibility of having different solutions when we have similar conditions. So for example, when we have namely the same level of asset specificity, how come we have different, different contracts or different ways of organizing production? And that recalls us of plural forms. So just to define plural forms, we will have a given firm relying on two or more organizational ways to organize similar, if not identical, transactions. In other words, we have transactions with similar or identical attributes being organized differently. And that has been labeled very differently throughout literature. We have plural forms, tapered integration, dual distribution, concurrent sourcing, plural sourcing. They're analyzing in different lenses, but they're basically the same thing, plural forms. But I told you my presentation is about diversity, and here I am telling you that I'm analyzing similar situations with different outcomes. So what is diverse about plural forms? And I will talk about three aspects, namely. I'll start with the empirical side. So what's diverse in terms of the empirical manifestation of plural forms? First, I'm going to talk about the object. As we all know, franchising is probably the most striking example of plural forms because franchise chains typically combine a percentage of company-owned units and a percentage of franchise stores. But plural forms go way beyond franchising. And just to show you some examples, we have a very large number of evidence of plural forms in agribusiness. Our colleagues have managed to fill an entire book with examples of plural forms in Brazil. Not only Brazil, but we also have other papers in different environments. We also have plural forms in services, for example, in the trucking industry, or in the provision of metallic components in an industrial perspective. And more recently, we even find plural forms in basic services, for example, parking or banking and other sectors. So the first point I want to highlight is the diversity of plural forms goes in terms of the object that goes way beyond franchising. The second empirical diversity is in terms of the composition of the plural form. So if we're thinking about using or relying on two different arrangements for similar transactions, the first thing that comes to our mind is making and buying. And I want to show you that we go way beyond just making and buying. And if we think about three classes of organizational arrangements, markets, hierarchies, or hybrids, we could be talking about any of the intersections of the three sets. So I want to show you a typology to organize the diversity of possible combinations. And the first one is the between type of plural forms. The striking example, making and buying, but that's not exclusive. Firms could combine any two types of organizational arrangements. And here I bring you some empirical evidence that I selected from the book that I showed you earlier, filled with examples. And we can see, for instance, that Corin is obtaining 60% of organic lettuce in-house and 40% through relational contracts, while Vibor is obtaining 90% through relational contracts and 10% through market arrangements. So we can see that we go way beyond making and buying, even when we think about the between type of plural forms. We also have the within type, which is a combination of different types of hybrids. And just to illustrate here, we have two very similar settings for Delphi and Atalaya, obtaining cocoa and coffee, name almost 50-50 relational contracts and formal contracts. And finally, firms can do what I call a combo. So they can combine between and within types of plural forms. And again, I bring you some examples. And we can see, for instance, cultivar is obtaining organic lettuce, 10% in-house, 40% with relational contracts, and almost 40% with formal contracts. But that's not all of it. This is a typology, but we can also look at the percentages or the weights of those different contracts or the different arrangements in the plural form. So here I have another example. These are the results of a case study we conducted at the Corin firm. It's the leading producer of organic products in Brazil. And we can see, we don't have enough time to explore those results in detail, but we can see that each type of contract is present to a different extent. So the million-dollar question is, how can we explain this diversity? And I'm going to use, like most of you, if not all of you, the Williamsonian view. And I think my approach is very similar to the presentation Jos has just delivered. I'm going to be talking about the interplay between asset specificity and uncertainty, the two key dimensions in transaction cost economics. And I'm going to argue that it's intermediate levels of asset specificity and significant uncertainty that will drive firms to use plural forms. However, each variable, asset specificity and uncertainty, will play a different role when it comes to explaining its diversity. So through a series of papers, I argue that the type of uncertainty, and I've only explored three types, market, technological, and performance assessment uncertainty, will be key to understanding the type of plural form between, within, or combo. And also that the higher the level of uncertainty and the more types of uncertainties that affect a given transaction, the more complex will be the resulting organizational arrangement. So we have uncertainty playing an important role in the type of plural form, and we have asset specificity shedding light on the relative weights. So in the Williamsonian tradition, the higher the level of asset specificity, the higher the percentage produced in-house or through with more coordination, say a long-term contract or a more complex arrangement than the spot market itself. And I would like to conclude my presentation with some future paths when we think about the diversity of plural forms and how to explain them. These are some open questions I have. First, I think we need much more evidence to understand the diversity of plural forms. So one potential path would be to explore, empirically explore this diversity of plural forms. It's there, but it's often overlooked. Second, I think there are other types of uncertainty that are relevant to explain the diversity of plural forms. For example, what happens with institutional uncertainty? And I think we have faced a lot of institutional uncertainty recently with the COVID situation and how the different countries handled this situation. What are the performance implications of the diversity of plural forms? So is there a particular type that outperforms the other, and how does that impact the performance of different organizations? And finally, there's one that I find particularly interesting, that is building a dynamic perspective, looking at the diversity of plural forms over time and trying to understand why some firms use plural forms and a particular type of plural form through time, and other firms are constantly changing either the weights or the types of plural forms, or switching from plural to non-plural forms at all. So what are the drivers for plural form resilience? And we already know from very recent research that are suggesting that the drivers for the existence of plural forms, the ones that I showed you today, and those for the persistence over time might differ. So thanks a lot. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks a lot, Paula, for your presentation. Well, we still have 5 minutes to end. I think it's not fair that the moderator can't speak, but I will keep the time, keep the eye on the watch, so we cannot break this culture, which is to end on time. But I just want to make 1 minute, put one issue in 1 minute. It's what I mean. It's amazing how vast is the research frontier, how complex each of you have raised so many issues, and it's clear to me that to answer these issues, we'll have to develop new theories, new ways of thinking. All the books, all the papers you have written have built the knowledge to which has now to be the basis for new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching the issues you have raised. I'm not an expert on the subjects you have talked about, but I would say that most of the questions are not answered, and we'll need further researcher, innovative researcher, new theories, new approaches, new methodologies to answer these questions, and they are all relevant, from fairness to new types of organization, new sources of information and data, new arrangements, new issues. So we still have a very vast frontier, and fortunately we can count on the passion of our students to go on and work harder with passion to face and answer this question. Please, I will give you the floor to each of you in 30 seconds for a final remark on the subject. We start now with Décio, which is with a full connection. Décio, with you.
I just shared the same feelings that you mentioned, Marcio. This was a very rich approach, and many different topics that in some way they match together, showing how vast is the field and how much we still have to advance. I like many points. I would like to mention particularly one point that Annie Royer brought about the issue of power and contracts. I think this is a very interesting point, still unexplored. Sometimes many scholars look to the contracts as being the big and the unique solution. However, contracts, they also reflect, of course, the condition of market competition. And therefore, they, in many cases, they still will have uneven results. One interesting point that you mentioned that has to do with the hog production, hog farmers. We have the same situation in Brazil. And I just thought about the possibility to look whether or not engaging in the collective contract, the standard contract with the integrator, it is or not a Pareto improvement for each farmer. What is the next best solution they will have to stay in the market. So this is, well, there are so many interesting points I like very much, all the papers, but particularly because what you mentioned, because this has to do with the problems that we also face, very similar conditions in Brazil. Well, I think this is the only point I'd like to make. Thank you, Marcio.
Okay, okay, Gaetano, now the floor with you for your final words. No, we cannot listen, we cannot hear. You're mute.
Just a few words.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Just a few words.
Yeah,
Because I was really impressed from many aspects of all presentation, and for example, by the fact that the analytical tools are converging, trying to identify the multiple role of contract, for example, in agriculture. There are different perspectives on that, which are at stake in this session, this panel. And also, I'd like to say that maybe this is also a sort of a sign of the ability of innovating the disciplines following the evolution of society. This is another very intriguing point. Even though the evolution is along similar lines, probably because we are similar scholars, at least for interest, to be honest. And for example, the possibilities provided by new institutional economics are really being innovating in this panel, enlarging the perspective. And there is more than Coase-Williams, to my view, in this discussion. It seems promising, and I'd like to read the future paper to see confirmed this view. That's it. Okay.
Please, with you.
Yeah. Well, like Paula said, I was quite impressed when I saw the title of the theme of this session, New Frontiers in Research, because I thought I've been working on contracts, vertical coordination, and collective action for the past about 20 years or so, 15, 20 years. And I thought we've done a lot. We've done a lot. But as I hear you, we're still going on. There's still a lot to dig in. And yeah, it's never finished. But we're going into more details, and we understand better. And I think this session was very. I think we met the objective of the theme. We are really going forward. And for the young scholars that are here today, there's still plenty of things and different dimensions, and we've seen all kind of levels: macro, meso, micro. So. Yes, very interesting session. Thank you.
Okay. Now,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one message I get from all the presentations together, I think, is the role of collective action in this contracting arrangements. It was mentioned by several of the speakers today that certainly if the contract, on the one side of the contract party is the farmer, then it's almost never an individual farmer. It's always some kind of group, informal group, formal group. And so I think that is a topic that certainly young scholars should go into, dive into more. And at the European level, there is now legislation, and Gaetano is also studying that, that promotes the producer organizations and interbranch organizations. And while it's relatively new, this law, I think we are slowly seeing some effect of that. That's certainly in the Netherlands, where some new organizations are being set up exactly to strengthen the power position of the farmers in their negotiation with large buyers, large traders, or large processors. So I think that's an element. This collective action among farmers in contracting arrangement is definitely something that we will see more of in the future. Thank you.
now, Paula, you.
As I said, I think the session was very interesting, but also very diverse. And it's very nice to see that we almost all of us have the same theories underlying our presentations, and still we managed to explore them in such diverse ways. And I think that's very nice, and it only highlights all the avenues we have for future research. Thank you.
Okay, now we are at the end. You're right, we have done a lot, and there's a lot to be done. And I invite all of you for the next session. It will be on contract farming, chain coordination, and institutional challenges, empirical evidence. It will be in Portuguese with direct translation to English. So all of you are invited to be here at 13:30 Brazilian time. So we are just we have 1 hour and 20 minutes to have a rest and join the seminar again, which will be very, very interesting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you a lot for we'll be here.
It's just too bad we cannot gather and
Yes.
I would have loved. Bye-bye.
Great to see you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao, Décio.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, Décio. See you soon.
See you, Gaetano.
Ciao.